following with the segments, we would like to know you more as a person. So first question in segment 1 will be, how much help and encouragement do you get from your family and friends? How does the overall chemistry functions? Do they understand the sensibility and sensitivity of the business you are involved in, which could affect like millions of people and generations coming in future?
Interesting. So, I mean, my family, friends, always very supportive. One thing that they know, when I was working as CEO, they would seldom see me unless it was perhaps the weekend. I put an awful lot of effort into building up the relationships and keeping the relationships, which is a very big part of the CEO role, which meant that you were networking or dinners or some meeting or other 4 or 5 nights per week, and then that would be coupled often with working breakfast. It was very much my personal style, but it meant that family in some respects were left a little bit on their own, which is okay for a short while, but not sustainable all the time. But they're all supportive, but also supportive in many different ways. We often had community open days, and family would always be there and sort of welcoming the community in. And I felt it was really quite nice that it wasn't just myself and others from just the business, but also the wider family. And it wasn't just myself, but and certainly customer events as well. We used to occasionally take wives and so forth. So it took the edge off it a little bit. But it is running a company like Siemens Mobility is a serious job. And when you're responsible for the safety, but also the availability and the reliability of 1/3 of all the trains that are running in any one day in the UK, it's a little bit of a sobering thought. And to think that you have many people out 24/7 making sure that those trains run, if it's just getting spray paint vandalism off the back of a toilet door, which is one of the most time-consuming jobs in a relatively short cleaning window, through to ensuring that we don't have the technical problems, or if we do have technical problems, we're not cancelling services, and making sure that all flows. It doesn't work always. There have been occasions when we haven't been able to get every train out of the door. But then working with customers that are slightly different, such as Eurostar, whereby the safety regime to go through the tunnel is something that you wouldn't really ever contemplate in the maintenance of the normal maintenance activities of our other fleets. I always remember I used to go and see Eurostar, their CEO and COO, on a weekly basis at one stage, and we would discuss every technical issue. And these issues would range from the fact that there were needles being put down washhand basins, and it was a non-solid pipe, so they would get stuck and cause blockages, through to the functioning toilets, the air conditioning units, which would sometimes have huge temperature differentials to cope with going into the tunnel. There would be a swing of perhaps 25 degrees in the space of 10 minutes. And then things like the water bottles from the manual fire extinguishing system, which we got caught out with at one stage. But that was all coupled with, again, another digitally enabled train, and making sure that that ran in order to, optimize the way it should be performing. So this was quite a lot of responsibility. And then the other side of the business is about making sure that trains don't crash into each other. We think of signalling as, setting a route. Well, it's setting a route safely. And when you want to actually get far more trains over the same infrastructure, but you're still using the same basic principles of a block, and you're shrinking that block to make sure that it works, and to make sure that we don't have another signalling cause rail crash, is quite a lot of responsibility at all. Now, a great example of that is the work that we did in Thameslink. So Thameslink is obviously the network that comes from essentially Cambridge, Peterborough, all the way through central London through a single tunnel, and then spreads out and goes down into Kent and to Sussex. It's a huge network, but it all goes through one single tunnel. When I first became involved with Thameslink, 20-something years ago, it had a capacity, I think, of 12 trains per hour in each direction. And there was a business case to actually build another tunnel, which wasn't physically possible because the land wasn't available. The land under the Thames was, but to build another railway where they wanted to build it was going to be very, very costly, demolishing a lot of buildings on the edge of the Thames. But also it was at a price that really the UK couldn't afford. So by taking the challenge of doubling that capacity through the same infrastructure and actually pushing R&D to break the boundaries of everything they knew, meant that we could double the capacity, and that's what we see today, currently running at 21 trains per hour with a capacity today of 24, but a design capacity of 28 trains per hour. But in doing that, we had to rewrite and rethink the principles of railway design or signalling design. And of course, ultimately, that stops with the CEO. And so I always wanted to understand what was going on. I always had huge trust in all of my engineers.
Nice.
And also ensured that we always had the correct quality system around it in order to protect myself, but also all employees in the business. Exactly. The principle of a signalling system is it always has to fail safe, and they always do. But it's pushing for that reliability, that increase. And it's paid off, I think, because we're now seeing that same principle going up the East Coast with trains that are, self-governing in terms of their maintenance and various other bits and pieces. So it was something that was always at the forefront of my mind, and certainly the board's mind, and some critical members of the business. We have to make sure we do this right.
Yeah, so considering also the team as a part of extended family, I would say,
yes,
is really the key here. How do you see risk and growth, and how do you think uncertainty should be handled? In a general perspective, but not in a terms of business, but as a general life.
So, risk is an interesting concept, because being in a regulated industry most of my career, so aerospace into rail, heavily regulated, the concept of risk is perhaps doing something that doesn't have a standard that's associated to it today. But then I look at some of the new companies coming in, particularly the small enterprises that are setting up, and they're really pushing the boundaries, and their concept of risk is very different from that of a big corporate or from myself. So they will say, right, well, we think you should be able to do X and Y, and we're just going to go out and do it. We're going to design the way to do it. I met a person the other day who said, well, we can repurpose midlife locomotives by taking all the diesel out, taking all the operating system out, and actually picking up automotive electric traction, automotive control, and applying it to railway. Now, the risk there is that the automotive principles are perhaps a little bit more progressive than anything we see in rail, and to apply those to the rail standards is going to be an interesting dilemma. Now, this individual, they said to me, well, it'll work. I've proved it'll work. So it's just about actually getting those principles accepted by those that approve what is acceptable on the railway here. I don't want to go into too much details, but that is the sort of risk that I now see coming into the industry. Okay. The risk of being able to take on board a whole TMS system, making sure that automatically you reset the routes rather than having a human double-checking it. Yeah. It's been coming over a number of years. The risk of getting rid of signals on the trackside. Okay. It's taken the UK a very long time in comparison to the rest of Europe to adopt ETCS, but it's now coming. And now we have the problem with the drivers are willing to try it, but they're really uncertain to take that risk, to trust the box, as they see it, that's telling them what to do in the middle of the display in the cab. So risk is in many different ways.
Yeah.
But the way I approached risk was not by taking huge risks, because being an incumbent and having a very large installed base, I didn't want to ever be in a position where something wouldn't work or that was pushing the boundaries too far. But I always wanted to have a differentiator. I always wanted to be ahead with technology, whatever it was, by 2 or 3 years. So a few years ago, almost as I became the CEO, I set up a digital directorate, both in the rolling stock side and in the infrastructure side, to look at how digital systems can actually push the boundaries of what we've been doing. And these may be, not high priority things, but they're subsystems, and actually how we digitize the sanding of the rails to stop slipping, or this system for monitoring the wheels coming in. But in their way, they were all a little bit of risk, because you're taking the human out and using it. And one of the things I'm really keen in understanding today is how AI can be used within the design process, within the testing and commissioning process, and actually taking the human out again.
Exactly.
Because they often are the determining element. And so that's how I approach risk, step by step.
That's nice. So do you think that taking small risk affects growth while going forward, or how do you measure both in terms of business?
You can never remain complacent.
Okay.
One of the things that we have to do, and that we never really measured terribly well at Siemens, was actually what we were continually adding to what we offered.
Exactly.
Now, there were so many different initiatives going on across all of the businesses that it was very difficult to say this was new and this is the turnover that's come because we've got something new. But it was always there. And it was when we won something like the East Coast Main Line digital signalling and the upgrade in 3 different sections, which is potentially £1 billion worth of business, then you suddenly realise that actually all these bits and pieces that we've been playing with have added together to become a system. And that system is immediately marketable. And then you look around and actually, unfortunately, none of our competitors have that with a UK badge on the top of it. And so that gave us that 3 to 5 years advantage there. Similarly with the rolling stock, we had the 700s and then the 717s coming in, fully digitally enabled, very much London-centric. And they were the next generation, and Siemens now need to follow that through with their next fleet in order to maximise what's going on there.
Nice, interesting. Given that I am an architect and you have worked your life in transportation industry, do you think how do you think these industries help in developing a nation? And according to the statistics, around 7 to 8% of the entire economy is contributed by construction sector in UK, and around 10 to 11% in India. Mm-hmm. So how do you think these industries contribute to the overall progress, and what are your thoughts on corporate social responsibility if added further?
Well, when you look at the whole construction element, London has for many years been the centre of the commercial or the banking markets. But that's always been mirrored by having the latest architecture, the biggest investment into buildings, but also it's been mirrored by having the best infrastructure. So, the train service into London, into the city, much moaned about, but it's always consistently got everybody in and everybody out to wherever they needed to live. And that joining together of infrastructure with, modern areas. And then you look back to the 80s and the concept of Canary Wharf. And that required having public transportation links. So there's the Jubilee Line extension, but then there was the advent of the DLR. So, infrastructure and transport effectively stopped at Bank Station. There was nothing past Bank, or certainly past the Tower of London. And then all of a sudden, 2 or 3 miles down the road, you had this huge area. And it's moved on out. And then you've seen other infrastructure areas that have opened things up, such as Crossrail, the Elizabeth Line. And you look at the booms that are in northern Kent, further east, all the way up to Plumstead. There's been huge amounts of development, so I'm sure there'll be many architects, but also, the trading of land and things like this. And then High Speed 2, again, the Curzon Street area in Birmingham, totally redeveloped beyond belief. And Euston will be developed with high-rise over the whole of the footprints that's there. So I think that new buildings and infrastructure go hand in hand. But we talk about, social responsibility as well. This has to be key in whatever we're doing. I remember when I first came into the industry a long time ago, my first Transport for London contract, and it said you have to employ apprentices from this place, and this place, because the railway line went through it. I thought, that's a bit curious. Then all of a sudden I got to understand what that was about. And that's 25 years ago. But today, if we don't put back into the communities, particularly some of those communities that we may not know, there's something going wrong. I mean, as Siemens, that stems in many different ways. It stems from building, schoolrooms in mid-Scotland. It is around doing community gardens for disabled people, but it's also about STEM activities in schools. It's about supporting people through colleges, and in fact, building up colleges that may be more deprived than others in order to have the capability. And then, of course, offering apprentices in coming out of those areas that we may be trying to support, and bringing people into our business that wouldn't have had that opportunity just by being there. So I think that it has a huge part to play. But of course, you can only do that if you're actually developing the area. So you've got to have that whole money flow in the first place.
So it's a concept of transit-oriented development, which you think it's started to develop and coming into reality by seeing Canary Wharf, and then we will see also in Euston.
Yes, and we go further out where HS2 will end.
Exactly.
And there are so many areas. I mean, Battersea Power Station, for instance, there was an extension to the underground there, albeit it was paid for by the developer, so it sort of goes hand in hand.
I always thought that first the infrastructure develops and then the real estate follows.
It seems to be reversing itself a little bit. Okay. But I think in India there's certain examples as well, with these high-speed lines where the stations are now, I think I'm right in saying that there's huge development going on there. I remember I had a project building a new railway, a light rail from Taipei Airport into the centre of Taipei, and every station, about 1.5 2 years, was full housing developments, long before the stations were open, and that whole area that had been agricultural for the full 22 kilometres became urban. So, that's infrastructure leading. Yes.
Nice. So moving on to segment 3, I call it as dive into the future. Describe how you believe future roles will change. For example, people in 60s and people nowadays are more technologically sophisticated. And how do you think AI will change the rail industry and data will become more important? Or do you think data will not have any relevance going forward?
No, data has to drive our railway moving forward. I look at other segments, not a direct comparison, but I was recently, when I was still at Siemens, at a launch of a new digital initiative. And there we had BMW telling us how they would repurpose all their manufacturing from manufacturing combustion engines across I don't remember exactly how many, but say 17,000 variants, and factory, which is manned by 12 people, that they, with help from Siemens, would then go to a number of variants of electric cars with 30% productivity and only 5 people in the space of 2 years. And this was all by digital means. So it was a data house, is using AI, repurposing the whole of the manufacturing process and monitoring it thereafter. And I started thinking, well, how do you apply that to railways? I mean, the manufacture of trains is, well, in the 1960s, it looked modern. Okay. But you still have individuals whose sole job is to look down the side of a train to check whether it has a dent in it. Mm-hmm. And every train design is bespoke because every operator wants a different train. And this is why Siemens with the Vectron locomotive have been so successful, because for the first time ever they built one locomotive that comes in one colour, which we keep in stock, that is applicable for the whole of Europe, and you can get that and only that, but it's cut an awful lot of the productivity down. But data has to run the railway. When we look at the infrastructure side of things and we look at getting the right level of train path, we look at how we could really improve the running of the railway, how we could improve the conflict resolution. If we don't start using AI in some shape or form to actually tell us what we're using people to try and analyse at the moment, we're never going to get there. The same with the design of infrastructure. It's still extensively done manually, as is the testing. And so any change or correction that's made is done by a person. Yeah. And without implementing AI there, we're never going to be able to automate that in order to get the cost savings that come from it. And then, of course, the most applicable today in my mind is using AI to monitor the failure modes of infrastructure and of trains, which is not done currently by anyone. And I think once we start doing that as an industry, and it's persuading the industry to do it, because even as Siemens, I couldn't tell Network Rail or the train operating companies to do this, and they are quite precious, shall we say, about the data and who gets to use it. And this is one of the things about Great British Railways and their launch. It is to have a central data repository so that most data can be available to most people that need it. Because I talk a lot about the trains and the infrastructure, but there's a lot more to a railway than that. Okay. If you actually think about the passenger experience and the abilities that AI and monitoring data would have, even in the flows of individuals through a station area, the use of retail and the positioning of the shops within there, the concepts of having air gates, so you don't have a physical gate to walk through and you have something that monitors and picks up your ticket automatically. And this all has to come. Here in the UK, we're a little bit behind what we see elsewhere. You go to places like Singapore and they are starting to implement data in a large way, albeit in a very small and very tight infrastructure. But I think that as we see perhaps the US and their new high-speed rail coming in, where they're looking for the latest of the technologies to be applied there, we might see some working examples that are actually using what other industries are using. Because after all, the concept of AI is not that novel these days. Exactly. Unless you work in rail.
Yeah, you can type Chat GPT today and ask them whatever. Yes. That's how AI is growing. Do you think organizations need some kind of improvements in their hierarchy, vertical hierarchy or horizontal hierarchy, to cater the needs of future generation as a talent?
I'm never a huge fan of gigantic hierarchies.
Okay.
I like a relatively flat structure, but within that, you need to I mean, the hierarchy is not going to generate the future talent. It's actually having the framework within that hierarchy to acknowledge the talent. To have the thinking, particularly within the senior management, that you don't have age boundaries. You don't have all the traditional boundaries that we might have seen 20 years ago.
Yes.
And that actually you can break the mold. I remember at Siemens I brought in the head of procurement, who's responsible for over $500 million of spend a year, at the age of 30, and there were quite a lot of eyebrows raised. And myself, when I was first given my managing director role, I was 30 and came into rail, and I thought, who's this young rookie? And I didn't know anything about rail then. But it paid off. If you don't give people the chance, they won't ever really be able to grow. But that has to be structured as well. And it has to be structured about building up on a regular basis conversations with them, giving them the chance to do something slightly out of the norm, and to push themselves. And a lot of that can be done within networks as well. And the advantage of a company like Siemens, even Siemens Mobility, is you had 5,000 plus employees and another 2,500 contractors on that, so 7,500 employees. So to be able to network through those, particularly for those high flyers or those that have been identified, was possible. But then I suppose the final part that I was a true believer in, and still am, is actually being able to do the academic side as well. Now, whether that's through in-company training, and I did sponsor a number of my employees on MBAs, or indeed through our own training facilities here in the UK, and the whole thing sort of knits together in order to make sure. Nice. But if you take your finger off the eye, and so many companies in the rail sector, they'll have a downturn, or there won't be this investment or that investment, and say, we're cutting the apprentices, we're cutting back on the training. And it only just lands in your lap 5 or 6 years later when you haven't got the right grade of people and you can't deliver your work. So you have to invest.
Yeah, I think investment in the talent inside the company is more important than searching for a talent.
It's, yes, a lot easier. And you can control what they learn as well.
Yeah, exactly. That goes in line with the company system and all the systems, yeah. Do you face any difficulties in retaining talent?
Talent in a small industry such as rail is always going to be problematic. If you take data scientists, you might think data scientists don't want to work in rail. They want to go to the sexy end, the Googles and Apples of this world. But what I found is there's a core of people in every discipline that like trains and that have an interest in what we do. And once you've actually got that interest, then they want to work for you. You have to retain them. You have to make sure that the package is correct. But putting package to one side, the biggest challenge I had at Siemens that still exists is the culture. Because you've got an old-fashioned engineering company that is still heavily regulated, and it's based upon 150 years worth of ways of doing things. And you bring people in, such as data scientists, to change the way we're working, to look at different ways of doing it. And not only do the data scientists often want more of a startup type mentality, but they also don't want to be held back in what they're doing by others that are sort of questioning this, questioning that, just because that's the way it's always been done. So it's, again, building that compromise and making sure that you create somehow the right opportunities. But the right culture as well.
Yes. That's nice. What kind of vision do you have for future rails? What do you say about Hyperloop? And how do you think AI will transform rail industry? How relevant? How can we improvise the experience of future generation? Till now, we are only considering to commute from point A to point B. But what other values we can add to enhance the experience?
I mean, the first thing I would say to you is if you go back 20 years,
Yeah.
the concept of taking a train to Paris, perhaps it's 30 years,
Yes.
was alien.
Exactly.
Now, it's quicker to get to Paris than it is to get to most UK cities.
Yeah.
So everything can be changed. You talk about Hyperloop. It's something I've been interested in for quite a long time. It's a concept that will have some trials. But I think if somewhere like Saudi Arabia does actually pick up and link all its cities with an underground Hyperloop system, it will then become credible. I don't know whether it will be a comfortable way of travelling on Hyperloop.
Okay.
I assume it will be. And I'm not even going to start contemplating the safety aspects of it. But we've done more technologically advanced things in the world than creating Hyperloop. So I think that there is a place for that. Perhaps not in my working life. But within the next 20, 30 years, I would hope that we can see something coming on board there quite successfully. But as we touched on before, running a train with it's at 600 miles an hour through a vacuum in a tube,
Exactly.
or whether it's running it at 200 miles an hour on some traditional tracks, if we're not monitoring what's going on, if we're not actually continually improving what's going on, we're never really going to be able to enhance it, and we will just end up with where we are now. I think transport, rail transportation in particular, is moving forwards. It is really gathering some momentum. High Speed 2 in the UK, but also, I mean, we just need to look what Spain did 15 years ago with its high-speed network. Germany building high-speed lines. India really pushing ahead. They are high-speed dedicated freight, upgrading all of their commuter rail in order to get the economic benefits of having infrastructure that comes. And then the US, amazingly, perhaps it's the price of fuel, I don't know, but they've realised there is something other than the motor car, and now they're investing in some high-speed intercity trains. Their dedicated freight routes are being enhanced. And again, they will not want to build thousands of kilometres of track if they don't have to, because there's a cost to that, there's a cost of maintaining it. So if we can enhance anything, particularly through using data and AI in order to get the optimized train. I mean, running a train at 600 miles an hour through a Hyperloop is one thing, but you still have a huge stopping distance, so you can run 1 hour. But if we got to the stage where we could use AI to predict how we could run a train at 150 miles an hour every 10 minutes, that would give us huge amounts of capacity. And that's where I see the industry going.
Oh, interesting. I had completely different perspective.
Right.
Thank you for sharing it. That brings an end to segment 3, our last segment. Some closing questions will be like, what advice would you like to give to young professionals who likes to pursue career in transportation and specifically in rail industry? And what are the skills which you think are essential for their success?
First of all, when I was young, the concept of going into rail was not very exciting.
Okay.
There were sexier areas to go into. But having been there for a long time, I think it's one of the best sectors you can go in. And if you're interested in coming into the rail sector, we actually need people like you.
Okay.
We really do need these new blood to come in, but with new thoughts. Rail is a little bit conservative with a little c in the way it adopts things. But it is pushing forward with technological movements that we're seeing. We are moving into digital systems, we're moving into the AI world, we are certainly moving into how to revolutionize what we do. But rail is part of a huge transport infrastructure, and it's when you link that up and you have connected mobility or mobility as a service, and you think about yourself wanting to go from your house on a journey to somewhere else, the concept of actually just buying a ticket is sometimes really, really tough. And if you can come into this industry and help revolutionize that, to get people into their comfort zone of using public transport, of which rail is a major contributor. It has such great effects for, the economy, but also for the climate that we live in, the country we live in, the environment we live in, the decarbonisation of everything. And hopefully it will reduce travel times.
Yes.
As I found out travelling here into London today, Sunday afternoons are not the place to be in a car, and I would much rather be on a train.
Yeah.
So,
so mobility as a service. You touched upon it, and how do you think is Google Maps or City Mapper functions are trying to achieve it, or
they touch upon it.
Okay.
And if you like, Google Maps is the minimum level, or City Maps, of what we would want to see. And it's how you enhance that. So mobility as a service, I want to go from my house in the countryside, and I need to call a taxi to take me to a bus stop, to take me to a railway station, and then to move on, to come into central London, underground, and then the DLR, to then get on the Elizabeth line and end up in North Kent. I want to be able to do that as one journey. I don't want to be able to do it as multiple journeys. But also, I want to know that these things will connect together, that I don't have 25 minutes to wait in the rain at the railway station, that I can buy one ticket, but actually I get the best value ticket, or I get the cheapest ticket knowing I've got changes. I also want to know that actually the journey I'm taking is emitting the least amount of carbon. And mobility as a service is about having one platform that tells you all of this. But it also includes some of those services we're not so aware of, like the dial to hospital. So, I can't get a taxi, there are no taxis, or can't afford it, so I can dial a ride. And a lot of these services exist, but they're not connected into any other form of transport. Similarly, we, as Siemens, we're looking at what is the concept of bringing regional taxi companies together, so that when you're sitting on the train, it automatically calls you a taxi to get you. And so mobility as a service is actually having seamless journeys.
Oh, that's completely interesting, and I see we are far away from it right now.
It's one of those opportunities.
Looking back at your time as CEO, what do you believe were some of the great lessons learned, both personally and professionally? I
suppose the biggest lesson, which I knew but really became so true, is to have trust and belief in your staff.
Nice.
When you become a CEO of a large company, you cannot be involved in everything. You have to look at the strategy, you have to look at the overall operation, but you have to ensure that others are empowered to do what they're best at doing, whether it's development, delivering, or whatever it is. And you also have to make sure that you create an environment that is inclusive. And I think in the time I was CEO at Siemens Mobility, I changed the environment quite extensively. Brought in a lot of different initiatives which were looking at how people were treated, how people were thought of, and the basics, getting rid of bullying, which you'd be amazed still exists. The concepts of even gender equality, let alone any other equality, in a railway depot in the middle of nowhere, it seems a little bit alien, and you have to make sure that you keep pushing away, because we talked a little bit about, how would I encourage people to come into the industry? Well, you have to come into the industry knowing that it is a total level platform. And so, those were a couple of the challenges I had, but I think a couple of the successes as well.
Nice. That was it. And to not be a secret anymore, what are your future plans now?
So I've done the big job, and I really enjoyed it, and I don't think I did it too badly. But for a variety of reasons, I'm not retiring. But I want to be involved in a number of businesses as opposed to one that can make a difference. Pushing the digital agenda extensively in the core rail that I know about, but in the wider transportation that I've touched upon. But looking at mobility as a service, connecting mobility, going into how we get a green agenda for transport in the UK, particularly around EVs and so forth. But then making sure that we have a safe environment. So one of the emerging problems we have is around cybersecurity, and how do we get that safe level, not just in transportation, but probably across a whole lot of different levels, in particularly the public sector, but also in the private sector, and making sure it's fit for purpose. Because we do not want others coming to control our infrastructure, unwelcome, shall we say. And then coupled with that, doing some more international work, some international assignments, which I haven't got anything just on the cards at the moment, but there are a few in the offing.
That's nice. Interesting. Amazing answers. Thank you. Thank you, Will. Thank you for joining us and accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me. It's been great fun.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, we can close it.